Hello everybody, it's Mr. G, the history teacher, coming at you with another Misconceptions in History. And today I'm going to talk about the STOL, also known as the vertical and or short takeoff and landing aircraft. While there's actually a multitude of these type of aircraft, we're specifically going to focus on the ones known as vectored thrust. All of the aircraft we're going to talk about today use a specific system in which they redirect gas, the heat, the thrust from the airplane to aid in lift. This is another one of those Cold War projects that took years, decades to become to fruition. And that's actually what we're going to talk about. Now, vectored thrust is actually nothing new. And in fact, the designs go back as far back as the 1930s. And essentially, this is redirecting the gas at the nozzle, the very tip of the jet engine, and allowing you to control it that way. It allows for modern fighter jets to have incredible maneuverability, but also provides vertical lift. Now, multiple countries tried to create their own VTOL, this vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, but the British had one of the earliest successes with their short SC-1. Now, it's not really much to look at, to be honest with you, but this laid the groundwork for all future aircraft, especially what we now know today as the Harrier. The Hawker-Siddeley P-1127 is actually a direct descendant of the SC-1. And the success of the SC-1 allowed this aircraft to be developed. And of course, this looks immediately like a Harrier. And that's because this would eventually develop into what we know as the Hawker-Siddeley Harrier jet. And so this became the first successful VTOL aircraft. Now, the Hawker-Siddeley Harrier filled a production need for a vehicle capable of both vertical and short takeoffs, the VTOL aircraft. The Hawker-Siddeley Harrier's success came from its 4 thrust vectoring nozzles, 2 on each side, and these 4 nozzles provided the thrust necessary to allow this aircraft to hover, maneuver, transition from vertical to horizontal flight, and completely revolutionize the VTOL and VSTOL industry. Now, multiple countries would also try to develop the VSTOL aircraft. West Germany, for instance, developed 3 different VTOL aircraft, but only one of them utilized thrust vectoring. The VFW VAC 191B, weird name, I know, was West Germany's answer to the possibility of an invasion from the Soviet Union through East Germany. And so they had utilized a VTOL aircraft that could be a rapid response and even carry nuclear weapons as a deterrent. They didn't get beyond the experimental stage and only built 3 of these aircraft. The French also joined in on this with their Dassault Mirage 3V VTOL aircraft. Similar to the Harrier, it used a series of thrust nozzles on the sides, 8 of them actually, 4 to each side, to help achieve lift. Like the German version, really only built 2 experimental aircraft, and they couldn't achieve what they really wanted with it. Not to be left out, the Soviet Union, seeing the success of the Hawker-Siddeley P-1127, decided to develop their own VTOL aircraft. They started with the Yakolev Yak-36, also known as the Freehand in NATO terminology, and this was their first attempt. They only built 4 of these, but it provided them with the early information they needed to get into the VTOL game. They would not have their first truly successful VTOL aircraft and VSTOL aircraft until the Yak-38, which does look extremely similar to the Hawker-Siddeley Harrier, and that's strictly an outside appearance. They completely did a redesign of how they do their thrust vectoring, their engine configuration. Everything's different on the internals. The Soviet design placed 2 of the nozzles directly behind the pilot, and then another 2 parallel to the engine at the rear, providing a triangular configuration. Now we get to the final Soviet design, the Yak-141. And this was going to be their final triumph, their amazing aircraft specifically designed to fly off of their unique style of aircraft carrier. But like so many things that were developed in the late 80s for the Soviet Union, they would become a victim of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the end, would just be relegated to just a few prototypes. Lockheed Martin actually did try to help save them, and was going to try to help provide funds to get their prototype going, mainly because a lot of the design features in it they wanted to use in their own X-35, which they were beginning to develop. Now, the United States can't be left out. Now we're going to first look at the Bell X-14. This extremely unusual looking aircraft was an experiment by Bell to show that the feasibility basically of a vectored thrust system, and allowed them to develop vertical and horizontal takeoff, hovering, the transition, all that would be needed to begin a VTOL and VSTOL program. Now, while the British jumped into what would eventually become the Harrier, the United States actually went a different direction. Designs such as the Republic AP-100 were thought to be the future of VTOL, VSTOL aviation. And in this, they designed an aircraft that utilized 6 turbojet engines to provide ducted fan thrust, as you see here. The idea being that these big giant fans, instead of using the heat from the thrust off of a nozzle, they would use these big fans to provide the thrust. They really couldn't get it beyond the development stage, so the United States actually went into a different direction, similar to the British. The U.S. version basically opened a series of doors and allowed the exhaust from those directly off the engine to provide thrust. The thrust-to-weight ratio was horrible. It was basically 1-to-1, meaning 1 pound of thrust for 1 pound of weight, which is not going to get you a whole lot of thrust, and the program was killed very quickly. And this would lead us to the United States building a licensed copy of the Hawker-Siddeley Harrier, known as the McDonnell Douglas, now Boeing AV-8E Harrier, also known as the Harrier II. And this has been an amazing platform for the United States for years. The Harrier proved itself for the United States during the first Gulf War and would become the backbone of the United States as their main quick attack support aircraft that was capable of being launched off of any of the amphibious carriers the United States had. However, there were a few limitations of the Harrier, and eventually it would be replaced with a new, more up-to-date aircraft. Now, in the 90s, there developed a program known as the Joint Strike Fighter competition, and this was basically an idea that with the end of the Cold War, there would be a need to replace some of the aircraft out there. So the idea was to create a single airplane that could be modified in production to meet multiple needs, meaning one version of the aircraft could be used strictly for naval combat, one could be used for strictly air-to-air scenarios, and then another one could be used for amphibious operations. Now, one of the capabilities these aircraft had to have was a VSTOL, so one model, one production unit had to be VSTOL capable. Now, the first of these was the X-32, and the other aircraft being the X-35, which would eventually win the competition to become the F-35. Now, this aircraft utilized a piece of old technology. It took something from the Republic AP-100. It actually had a large thrust fan built right behind the pilot, similar to the AP-100, and then also combined vector thrusting at the rear of its engine, which the whole nozzle could actually rotate 90 degrees. And this new platform allowed them to build a very capable VSTOL aircraft. And there you have a semi-quick look at VSTOL aircraft. I know I specifically focused on the jet and vector thrust. Next time I will talk about tilt wings and tilt jet, so we could discuss the V-22 and some of the more crazier designs that were developed during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. So I look forward to talking to y'all on the next time.